Texas. A late winter night, the wind swept through the poor neighborhoods of Texas, carrying the cold into every corner of the worn-down houses. Inside the small St. Mary Church, the soft golden glow of candlelight flickered against the aged wooden walls. The scent of old timber blended with the faint wisps of smoke from the small candles, creating an atmosphere of warmth and serenity. This was no ordinary church service. Tonight, people had gathered not just to pray, but to meet a man they had only seen on television, on glossy posters, the legendary Shaquille O'Neal, or as the world knew him, Big Shaq. Though he was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in America, this night was different. Those who had always seen Shaq in the iconic purple and gold jersey of the Los Angeles Lakers, with the bold number 34 printed on his back, his massive Nike sneakers shaking the court with every step, would find a strange contrast in how he appeared tonight. Shaq was not wearing his dazzling game uniform, nor was he illuminated by the blinding lights of a packed stadium, surrounded by thousands of roaring fans. Instead, he was dressed in a simple black suit, with a white dress shirt underneath that seemed slightly too loose, as if it could not quite contain the enormity of the man within. His polished black leather shoes tapped lightly against the wooden floor as he walked toward the pulpit, each step carrying an unseen weight. There was no grand stage, no flashing cameras, no aura of an NBA powerhouse commanding attention. Instead, Shaq settled onto a plain wooden chair, his long legs uncomfortably folded in the confined space, yet he paid no mind to it. Everything about his demeanor, from the way he sat to the way he scanned the room, radiated a sense of closeness. For those accustomed to seeing Shaq as a dominant force on the basketball court, a colossus of power and skill, an unstoppable warrior, tonight, the contrast was undeniable. He was no longer draped in the vibrant colors of competition. There were no highlight reels playing overhead, no deafening chants of his name from the crowd. He was simply a man with thoughts deeper than the ocean, a man carrying stories that only experience could carve into a person's soul. His usual radiant smile was absent. There were no booming laughs, no light-hearted jokes to entertain the crowd. On the court, Shaq was a force of nature, a titan who shattered backboards with a single dunk. But tonight, seated before the long wooden pews of the church, he was just another soul, burdened with the same questions, losses, and silent prayers that everyone else carried. The golden candlelight cast soft shadows across his face, accentuating the rough contours of a man who had stood atop the highest peaks of fame, yet had also walked through the valleys of doubt, loss, and unanswered questions. Among those in attendance that evening, there was a 9-year-old black boy, his deep eyes holding a pain far beyond what any child should ever have to bear. Jerome, dressed in tattered clothes and worn-out sneakers, clutched a thin sweater, the only thing keeping him warm against the biting Texas winter. He hadn't come to speak. He hadn't come to be seen. He had come to listen, to search for something, anything, that might fill the emptiness inside him. His mother had passed away from a cruel illness the year before. His father had left long ago. Now, in the small house he shared with his grandmother, bills kept piling up, food was scarce, and sometimes, Jerome felt like God had forgotten he existed. The evening stretched on, nearly an hour filled with stories, Shaq's childhood, his journey through basketball, the lessons he had learned after stepping away from the game. One by one, people in the audience raised their hands. Some were kids, eager to ask about basketball. Others were adults, curious about his life beyond the sport. The room was alive with conversation. But Jerome sat in silence. Inside him, something stirred. A question had haunted him for months, whispering in the dark as he curled up on his old mattress, gnawing at him between meager meals, gripping him with fear about a future he couldn't see. And then, as if led by an unseen force, he stood up. All eyes turned toward him. A small, frail boy, his clothes too thin for the season, his hands slightly trembling, his eyes carrying questions that had no easy answers. Shaq saw him. And for a moment, the warmth in his usually confident gaze softened into something deeper, something that recognized pain that had once been his own. Jerome's voice shook, but his words were clear. "Mr. Shaq, how do you still believe that God is there, when all you've ever known is pain?" The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into a silent lake. The room froze. Every whisper, every cough, every creak of a wooden pew vanished. Shaq did not respond immediately. Instead, he sat in stillness, as if measuring every possible answer in his mind. For the first time in a long time, Shaquille O'Neal had no immediate response. The eyes of the room were on him, watching the towering figure who had always seemed so unshakable. They had seen him dominate the courts, a force of nature, imposing, relentless, unstoppable. But now, something had changed. His expression was no longer that of a man who had all the answers. A flicker of hesitation. A trace of uncertainty. A shadow of something unspoken. His massive hands, the same hands that had lifted 4 NBA championship trophies, that had shattered backboards, that had commanded respect on the court, moved slowly to his face. His fingers pressed lightly against his chin, his thumb and index finger tracing the deep lines carved by years of experience. His broad shoulders, once carrying entire teams to victory, now seemed just a little heavier. He didn't look at the crowd. He only looked at the small boy before him. And in that moment, he looked at himself. The room stood still, but in Shaq's mind, time was moving in reverse. He was no longer a grown man. No longer a basketball legend. He was just a kid again, a big, lonely kid, sitting alone in his bedroom, wondering if anyone out there truly cared. Shaq blinked. This question. He took a slow breath, leaning forward, his massive hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. His deep voice, usually so strong, so unshaken, now carried something else, a quiet weight, an old truth. He locked eyes with Jerome. And for the first time that night, he wasn't speaking as a celebrity. He was speaking as a man who had once asked the exact same question in his darkest moments. Then, Shaq looked directly at Jerome. "I used to feel the same way you do." Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, lowering his head slightly, as if Jerome's question had stirred something deep within him, memories long buried, yet never forgotten. Maybe that was why this question had stopped him in his tracks. When an opponent charged toward him on the court, Shaq knew exactly what to do. He had to extend his arms, use his body to block, to dominate, to score. But this question? He couldn't use strength to answer it. He couldn't dunk his way past it. He couldn't slam the ball to the floor and roar like he had in his playing days. Shaquille O'Neal, the giant, the unstoppable force who had torn through defenses and shattered backboards, now stood before a small, fragile boy, and for the first time in his life, he felt small. He exhaled slowly. "You know, Jerome, I used to ask that same question." All eyes were on him now. The man who had once seemed invincible was now admitting that he had once been lost, too. "When I was a kid, I had nothing. My family was poor, very poor. I used to sleep on the floor because we didn't have a bed. There were nights when my mother had to skip meals just so I could eat." Shaq paused. His gaze drifted, as if his mind was reaching back to those days, to the cold, the hunger, the quiet suffering. "I remember looking at other kids who had nice clothes, new shoes, parents who could take care of them. And I used to ask myself, if God really loves all his children, then why is he letting me live like this?" Jerome's eyes widened. He had never imagined that a man as powerful, as famous, as untouchable as Shaq could have ever lived a life like his. Shaq let out a quiet, sad chuckle. "One night, I was just so tired. So angry. I walked into a church, sat in a corner, and spoke to God, straight up. I said, "If you're really out there, then where are you? Why are you leaving me all alone?" Shaq's deep voice softened, and his eyes found Jerome's once more. And you know what? God didn't answer me right away. But he sent me something else. He sent me my mother. Shaq paused, as if he could feel the presence of his mother, the woman he had always cherished. My mother once told me, "Shaq, faith is not about having all the answers. Faith is about continuing to believe, even when you don't have any answers at all." He took a slow, deep breath before looking directly at Jerome, his expression full of sincerity. "Jerome, I don't know why you've had to go through so much pain. I don't have an explanation for all the unfair things in this world. But I do know this, God did not put you here without a reason." The boy trembled slightly, his small frame barely able to contain the emotions welling up inside him. "But what if I'm too weak to keep going?" Shaq rose from his seat. Without hesitation, he stepped down from the stage. The entire room watched as the towering man, once larger than life on the basketball court, lowered himself onto one knee before the fragile boy. When he reached Jerome, he placed a large, gentle hand on his small shoulder. "You don't have to walk alone." A hushed stillness fell over the room. God sends us people to help us, family, friends, sometimes even strangers we don't expect. And sometimes, you will be the one to help someone else, even if you don't realize it yet. Jerome lowered his head, his tears falling silently onto his small hands. Shaq's deep voice softened even more, steady but full of conviction. "You are strong enough to stand up tonight and ask a question that many grown men are too afraid to ask. And that, Jerome, that is the first step of faith." No one in the room could have ever imagined that this man, this mountain of strength, had once felt weak. Shaq looked down for a moment, his massive hands lightly brushing over his knees, as if trying to connect with the boy he had once been. For a man who had spent his life breaking barriers on the court, this was the most important wall he had ever torn down. "I was born into a poor family," Shaq continued, his deep voice carrying through the still air of the church. "My mother worked 2 jobs, and some days, she didn't have enough money to buy food. I used to sleep on the floor, no bed, no blanket, just the hard ground beneath me. There were nights when I curled up, holding my stomach, listening to it growl, and there was nothing I could do." The church fell into absolute silence. Shaq was no longer the larger-than-life figure they had all seen on television. He was a man. A man who had once been a boy, just like Jerome. A boy who had known hunger, cold, and loneliness. "I used to look at other kids who had nice clothes, warm meals, parents who loved and cared for them. And I asked God, if you love all your children, why are you letting me suffer like this?" Shaq stopped. His eyes, usually steady and unwavering, held a glimmer of something different. They were just a little red, just a little heavier. But his voice remained firm. "And you know what? God didn't answer me right away. He didn't appear in the sky. He didn't send a miracle. But he sent me something else." Shaq took a slow, deep breath, his massive hands clenching slightly over his knees. "He sent me my mother." For a brief moment, Shaq closed his eyes, as if he could feel her presence beside him, as if he could still hear her voice, strong and unwavering. "One day, my mother put her hands on my shoulders and said, 'Shaq, God doesn't always make life easy. But he always gives you strong enough legs to keep walking.'" Jerome's gaze dropped to his old, tattered sneakers. A small tear had formed at the tip, exposing the worn-out fabric beneath. His toes were barely peeking through. Shaq noticed. And then he lowered himself slightly, leveling his gaze with Jerome's. "Do you know what that means, Jerome? It means that sometimes, God doesn't take away your pain. But he gives you the strength to survive it. The room remained utterly still as Shaq's words settled over them like a heavy, invisible weight. No one whispered. No one shifted uncomfortably in their wooden pews. No one even turned the pages of their Bibles. They all just sat there, letting the truth of his words sink in. And then, from the back of the room, a quiet voice broke the silence. A man stood up. His frame was sturdy, his broad shoulders a testament to years of hard labor. His hands, thick, rough, and calloused, told the story of a life spent working under the scorching sun and the weight of heavy tools. Hands that had built. Hands that had endured. Those hands had held his wife, once. Now, they trembled ever so slightly at his sides. His voice was deep, yet there was hesitation in it, as if the words he was about to speak had been locked inside him for too long. Shaq, I lost my wife last year. A car accident. I lost my faith with her. I don't feel God beside me anymore. Can I ever find him again? A pause. His throat tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw. You said God never leaves us. But how am I supposed to believe that, when I begged him to save her, and he didn't? A tense silence gripped the room. Shaq looked at the man for a long moment. There was no quick answer. There were no scripted words to ease that kind of pain. Shaq exhaled deeply, then stepped down from the pulpit, walking straight toward him. With a height of 2'16", Shaq was a mountain of a man, towering over everyone in the room. Yet, as he reached the grieving husband, he lowered himself, gently placing a massive hand on the man's shoulder. His voice, so often commanding, was soft now, careful, full of understanding. I don't know your pain, Shaq admitted. I wouldn't dare say I do. But I know one thing, faith isn't something you lose forever. Faith is a fire. Sometimes, it burns low, even goes out. But all it takes is one small spark, and it can come back to life. The room remained still, every soul hanging onto his words. For a moment, Shaq closed his eyes, remembering the day his sister left this world. He could still feel the ache, the unbearable weight of loss pressing against his chest. His heart trembled, but his face remained steady, his eyes clear. His voice, deep and gravelly, carried the weight of someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. God doesn't always show up the way we expect, Shaq said, his tone low but unwavering. Sometimes, he isn't there to stop the bad things from happening. Sometimes, he's there to help us survive them. He swallowed, his grip tightening on the man's shoulder, not as a sign of dominance, but as a quiet, unspoken promise. God didn't bring your wife back. But he didn't abandon you either. Maybe. He brought you here tonight so you could find what you thought you lost. The man lowered his head, his hands clenched into fists. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, a small, almost imperceptible nod. Shaq didn't press further. He knew some burdens weren't lifted in a single night. Some wounds didn't heal with just words. But faith? Faith had just taken one small step back toward him. Then, from the front row, a woman slowly rose to her feet. Her skin was deep brown, her face etched with the passage of time. Wrinkles lined her features, not as signs of weakness, but as proof of a life well lived, a battle well fought. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, and her silver hair was neatly pinned into a bun. She stood with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, yet refused to break. The way she carried herself, calm, steady, unshaken, made it clear life had tried to break her once. But she had survived. And now, she had something to say. Her voice, raspy with age, yet heavy with undeniable weight, cut through the silence. I have lived for 70 years, she said, her words deliberate, each syllable carrying the burden of a lifetime. And in those years, I have faced what no mother should ever have to endure. I have buried my son." A hush fell over the room. A soft breeze whispered through the church, carrying with it the scent of aged wood, mingling with the quiet, unspoken grief that filled the space. "He was only 20. Her voice trembled, but she did not waver. "A good boy. He never hurt anyone. And yet, one evening, I got a call from the police. A car accident. Just like that, I no longer had a son." She paused, her lips trembling slightly, her fingers tightening around the edges of her dress. "I blamed God." Her admission hung in the air like a confession, raw and unfiltered. "I stopped praying. I spent years drowning in anger. Years asking, why him? Why my baby?" She turned then, her gaze locking onto Shaq's. Despite the sorrow that shadowed her expression, her eyes held something else, a quiet fire, a mixture of both tenderness and torment. "So tell me, O'Neill." Her voice did not break, though it quivered at the edges. "How does a mother ever believe in God again after losing the child she spent her whole life loving?" Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. When he opened them, something in his gaze had shifted. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. The anticipation was thick. No one moved. No one spoke. Shaq let out a slow breath, his massive hand reaching out, resting gently over her thin, aged fingers. His voice, lower now, quieter, but carrying an unshakable force, broke the silence. "Do you remember the last time your son smiled at you?" The woman trembled. "The last time you hugged him?" Tears streamed down her face. Jordan gently squeezed her hand. "That love is still here. It didn't disappear. It didn't vanish with your son. And if you can still feel it, then God never left you. You don't have to forgive God today." Shaq's voice was as soft as a breeze, yet within every word lay the strength of a lifetime. Her lips quivered. A single tear fell. Shaq placed a gentle but steady hand on her shoulder, his massive hand, as if it could shield an entire world. "That love is still here. It hasn't faded. It didn't die with him. And if you can still feel that love, then God never abandoned you." The woman did not hold back her tears this time. But she didn't turn away. She didn't hide. She stood there, tears falling onto the hands that had once held her son. And she was no longer angry. A boy's voice breaks the silence. Jerome had been silent all this time. He said nothing. He simply clutched his worn notebook to his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that felt too uncertain. But now, he took a slow, deep breath, then lifted his head. "My grandpa used to say, 'Faith is like a seed,'" he said, his voice small yet firm, strangely steady for such a frail frame. "You don't always see it grow right away. But if you're patient and you believe, one day, it will sprout and flourish." Shaq looked at the boy. A faint smile touched his lips, not the booming, hearty grin everyone knew him for on the court, but something softer. Warmer. Full of respect. "Your grandfather must have been a very wise man," he said, his deep voice thoughtful. And he was right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always grow when we want it to. But that doesn't mean it's not growing. Sometimes, we just can't see it yet. Shaq placed a large but gentle hand on Jerome's shoulder. And with a slow nod, he acknowledged him. "You reminded us all of what truly matters." Then, Shaq straightened, his gaze sweeping across the room. His voice was deep, steady, not loud, but powerful. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small things, the times when someone reaches out to help, when someone simply listens in our moments of sorrow, or when a boy like Jerome asks the question that so many grown men are too afraid to face. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His eyes met each face, acknowledging every soul in the room before he continued. Tonight, I'm not standing here to tell you that faith is easy. Because it's not. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth holding on to. The room seemed to breathe as one, and then they stood. All of them. As if drawn by an unseen force, they rose together, without hesitation. No one told them to stand. No one needed to. Because they knew, they had just witnessed something greater than words. And at the center of it all, Shaquille O'Neal stood tall, towering like a mountain, a figure of sheer presence. But tonight, he was no longer Big Shaq of the NBA. Not the warrior who had dominated under the basket. Not the legend with 4 championship rings. Not the millionaire driving Rolls-Royces through the streets of Los Angeles. Tonight, Shaq was just a man. A man who had walked through darkness, who had been lost, who had questioned God, and who had found his faith again. The same giant who had shattered backboards with a single dunk now stood quietly, arms open, offering something far greater. No stadium lights. No roaring crowds. No commentators shouting his name. Just people. Real people. People with broken hearts. People who had carried the weight of loss, doubt, and pain for a lifetime. Shaq looked around the room, a room that would never be the same again. For a lifetime, he had used his strength to dominate the court. Tonight, he used his heart to touch souls. He looked at each person, and his eyes, no longer the eyes of an athlete, no longer the eyes of a giant, were the eyes of a man who understood pain, despair, and loss. Then he spoke, his voice deep yet powerful, like thunder from a distant storm. Faith is not when everything is going well. Faith is when you've lost, when you've fallen, when you're in so much pain that you think you'll never rise again, but you still choose to keep moving forward. The room fell silent. The black men who had spent their lives fighting poverty, battling discrimination, and enduring losses now listened intently to Shaq's every word. He lowered his voice, each syllable settling into the air like a sacred whisper. Faith is when you can no longer see the light but still know that the sun will rise tomorrow. Those words reached into the deepest, darkest corners of every soul in the room. They touched the men who had lost their brothers in senseless street conflicts, the women who had wept beside hospital beds, watching over their husbands and children. They touched the souls that had stumbled and fallen on life's path, those who had bowed their heads before adversity because they had nothing left to believe in. Today, they heard what they needed to hear. Shaq wasn't just speaking. He was giving warmth. He was healing. He was awakening the souls that had long been buried beneath suffering and doubt. Applause erupted. But this was different from the ovations Shaq had received after victories on the court. This wasn't admiration for a sports legend. This was gratitude for a man who stood among them not as a superstar, but as a brother, a father, a friend. A man who dared to speak the truths that many were afraid to face. Men who had spent a lifetime being strong, hiding their tears behind years of hard labor, now let them flow freely down their faces. Women who had prayed countless nights without an answer now held each other's hands tightly, feeling, perhaps for the first time, that God had always been there, they had simply never allowed him to speak. An elderly woman, her silver hair gleaming like moonlight, stepped forward, her hands trembling. No one knew what she was thinking, but everyone felt the sacred weight of each step she took toward Shaq. She said nothing. She simply placed her frail, weathered hands into the vast expanse of his. Shaq's fingers were strong, steadfast, like a mountain. But in this moment, it was he who became the place of refuge. He bowed his head, gently squeezing her hands in silent respect. He didn't need to speak, because in this moment, everyone in the room understood. He looked around, his gaze sweeping across each face. They were looking at him, but no longer with the eyes of spectators admiring an NBA legend. They looked at him as a man who had walked through darkness and returned, carrying light for those still lost. Shaq took a deep breath, his eyes shimmering with the quiet certainty of a man who had found his path. If tonight, someone in this room has found even a sliver of the faith they once lost, if someone feels a little lighter, a little stronger, then I know that God is here, right now, with us. The applause that followed crashed like thunder. Not for Shaquille O'Neal. Not because he was once an NBA legend. But because tonight, he had become a light. Jerome stood there, glancing around, feeling the warmth ripple through the room. He turned to his grandmother, his eyes brimming with tears, but they were filled with something else, too. Hope? Grandma. God is really still here, isn't he? The elderly woman squeezed her grandson's hand, her own tears tracing paths down her wrinkled face. God never left, Jerome. Sometimes, we just forget where to find him. That small room in Texas was no longer just an old church. Tonight, it had become a place where faith was reignited, where weary hearts had been unburdened. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to continue receiving inspiring stories, stories that just might change a soul.